Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Artillery Fishing. Today we're going to be going over the jig.
Please hang up and try again.
As you can tell by the title and the intro, we're going to be going over the jig. Not just one jig, but we're going to try to cover as many jigs as people typically throw out there. Jig fishing is one of the most versatile and fun ways that you can catch a bass. Because literally you could use a multitude of different jigs and catch bass all year round. If there was one bait that I had to have with me and I was in the middle of nowhere and I only had one rod, one reel, and one bait, it would be a jig, of course with a trailer. One of the best things about jigs is the fact that you really don't have to have much skill to throw them, just a little bit of knowledge of where the fish might be. Well, let's go over the anatomy. There are so many different types of jigs out there, and I'm going to try to cover most of them, but let's go over the basic anatomy of a jig first. As you can see in my hand, I have a jig. And the basic anatomy of these jigs is: one, you got your line tie, which you tie your line to, obviously. Two, you're gonna have a weed guard. Not all of them come with them, but some of them do, and these are very, very useful because they do exactly what they say. They keep the weeds out. Number three, your hook. Depending on the jig you're throwing, a lot of times though, they come a very heavy hook, because when those fish are grabbing it and the type of cover you're throwing it around, you need to have a heavy hook to go ahead, get that thing up that fish's mouth. Number four, a skirt, just like this. Now this ain't your Sunday skirt. This is a skirt for a jig on the bait, and we'll talk about why a skirt is very important here soon. And last but not least, the head. The head is what separates out a lot of these different jigs. Just what different type of head size you have, what the shape of the head is. It can all affect the action that it's gonna have. Now that we talked about the basic anatomy of a jig, let's go into the different jig heads, because that's the one that's the most versatile. This one that I've been showing you and I have right here in my head, this is typically called an archy jig, and it's mostly given that just because of the archy looking nature of the jig head. And what this does is when you throw it in water, you can either swim it, you can pitch it, you can put it in docks or underneath docks, and when it sits there, it's got this flat part right here. If I get this skirt out of the way, got this flat part right here when it's sitting, and you'll see when we bring it over to the tank, it typically sits like this, so that way the bait is kind of sticking up, the hook is right here, so that way when the fish grabs it, if it's sitting on the bottom, all you got to do is yank up, this gets moved down underneath, and the hook right there in the roof of the mouth, exactly where you want it to be. The next one we'll talk about is the football jig. Reason being why it's called the football jigs, check out that head right there. It's shaped like a freaking football, y'all. What a football head does on these jigs is it makes it wobble on the way down, and you'll see when once we get to the tank once again, it gives this little subtle wobble on the way down, making that bait look totally different as it's going down. The next jig head is a swim jig head. A lot of times they might come in just solid normal colors. Me personally, I prefer the ones that have like a more fish type color. This one, obviously trying to imitate a shad with this. You got the skirt, you still got the cover here and the big hook, and this is used for what pretty much it sounds like. It's gonna swim. And the head of it is a lot more aerodynamic if you haven't noticed, and a lot of times, like I said, they got that fish shape to it. The next one is gonna be a finesse jig. The difference with the finesse jigs is they're typically smaller. The head's a little bit of a different shape. It's more of that round shape, and you use these in situations when you want to take, when you're fishing and the bite is kind of slow and you need a slower presentation that you can poop up, pop off, put down in the bottom, and that's typically the best time to use these finesse jigs. Once again, smaller size jig, not as large, and fished very, very slowly. The next head is going to be a punching jig. These do exactly what their name suggests. They punch through things. So they're made where you got this heavy, thick, matted grass all over the place, and they just punch on through that heavy, thick, matted crap to get down beneath where the fish are hanging out, chilling. Typically fished on a very hot day or a hotter day, middle of the day type scenario where the fish are underneath some cover and they're just trying to get some shade. And what this does is it punches right through there, so that way you get penetration and you're trying to target those fish that are hiding from the sun trying to catch their shade. And normally these things got a very heavy hook on it. Reason being is because you got to go through a lot of crap to get down to where the fish are. Definitely will always have a brush guard on it. And the weights for these jig heads, I mean, they can range range anywhere. I've never seen them really lighter than an ounce though. Ounce jig head is typically what you're gonna find on these punching rig setups. And just the way that this jig head is set up, you can tell that it's made to easily punch through that grass. And this last one is what I like to call a wobble jig head. And you can throw this in the jig head family if you want. Some people don't. I like to do it because it very similar, does the same thing that most jigs you want, but the difference is it wobbles. This one specifically doesn't have a brush guard on it. As you can see here, you have these split rings which are connecting it, which allow this jig head right here, this ball-shaped jig head, to just go ahead and wobble as it floats down, giving it a little bit more wobble than a football jig. And once again, you're gonna see it when we throw it in the tank. Typically when you are throwing these jigs, you are gonna notice once you do get hit, a lot of the time that you're gonna get your strikes is when it's falling, when that jig is falling and you get these back flippers here on your trailer, which is another important thing. You always wanna have a trailer on these jigs, is when they're falling, they get this kicking up motion, and that's when a lot of times when you're throwing around docks and different types of cover where a fish will grab on, latch onto that thing, and you can set that hook like a beast and pull that fish in your boat. There's other little appendages that you can put on there too. Sometimes they come with rattles like you got right here. Give it that little rattling noise, and what that does is just draws more attention. That's an option. You don't have to have it, but me personally, I say why not? What does it hurt? Absolutely nothing. You're just gonna get a little bit more traction in there. When these jigs are falling, that's typically when you're gonna find the strike. If they don't strike then, don't worry. Let it go down to the bottom. It's gonna sit there like I was talking about in that upwards motion, and the fish is probably gonna be sitting there staring at it like, do I wanna bite this thing? Do I not wanna bite this thing? Every now and then, maybe give it a little pop, let it come back up, sink back down, little pops. You gotta see what works with you. You gotta play around with it. Try different things. Give big pops, give little shakes, something different, because you don't know what that fish is looking for exactly until bam, he bites on it. And when they bite on it, then you know, okay, the fish in this area are going for that kind of thing. Hey, you know what? Let's stop talking about it. Let's go to the tank and see what these different jigs look like in the water. Okay, so the first one that we're gonna throw is gonna be this Arky jig. Once again, I call the Arky jig the all-purpose jig because that's pretty much what it is it's all-purpose. Let's see what it looks like. When you're looking at this Arky jig, what I want you to take note of is look how it stands up. Look how those appendages on the trailer are just kind of sticking up there. They're moving around depending on what the water's doing. If there's some current in there, that's giving it some wobble. Another thing is look at the skirt. Look at what the skirt does. That skirt puffs up and sticks out. That's what entices a lot of fish, is when that skirt sticks up and puffs on out, starts falling around. Fish are looking at that. They're sitting there staring. They're seeing if they want to grab onto it or not. Another key is, like I said on the fall, look at the appendages. Those appendages as the bait is falling. And when I say this jig, the Arky jig, is versatile, what I'm meaning by it is you can swim it. When I'm saying this Arky jig is versatile, what I'm meaning is you can swim it, you can play with it while it's up in the middle of the water column, or you could just let it sit and give it a couple jerks every now and again. The Arky jig is your all-around jig that'll cover most of what you want in a jig. If you're brand new to jig fishing and you're just starting out, I highly suggest using one of these Arky jigs. Moving on next to the football jig. And what this football jig does is it gives it a little bit of a wobble. It's probably harder to see because we don't have a lot of water to work with here, but it does make it more of a wobble when it's going down. And same deal, legs are kicking like crazy as they're falling down, and when it stands upright. Those appendages start going all over the place. That'll entice a strike. Same thing with the skirt. Skirt flares up. This one, I actually trimmed up the skirt a little bit. Sometimes too long of a skirt gives a bad flare, and when you cut it up, that flare looks a lot better. Okay, next one we got is the swim jig. Just as its name suggests, this is actually made for swimming around, going all over the place, getting those tail whips, getting the tail action in there. Looking like a shad in water. Now that doesn't mean you can't drop it down to the bottom and let it sit, but primarily these things are made for whipping through grass, swimming around cover, swimming around areas that most of your typical crankbaits can't get to. And that's the beauty of the swim jig, is it can get through all that thick grass, that thick cover. But you can also work it like a normal jig and let it sit down on the bottom and pop it up. Next one is the finesse jig. Finesse jig was, like I was saying, it's smaller and it's made for a more finesse style of fishing. So smaller movements, kind of leaving it in the same place. It's for when the bite is really tough and maybe they don't want to bite on something huge. Same action as all these other jigs. Drops down, appendages go crazy, skirt flares out, sit there, pop it up. Do whatever the heck you want to it. It's for those finicky times. Next is that punch rig. Now I can't really demonstrate how awesome the punching rig is in this very clear fish tank. But same purpose when it drops down to the ground. Appendages flying everywhere, skirt goes crazy. But the main thing about the punch jig that separates it from everybody else is that big old heavy head it's got, specifically designed for punching through grass. And lastly, we got that wobble jig. That wobble jig just gives it a different motion when it's falling. And in here, it honestly does not look as different as you would think it was. You figure it'd have more of a swinging style. I have heard this called a swing head jig before, but the big difference you see is it's not standing upright like it would on the other jigs. But it is an option to go ahead and throw when fish are being finicky and you just want to throw something different to give a different presentation. Let's talk about the different nuances and functions of these different rigs. Number one, let's go over the weight. The weight, typically what you're gonna see is about a 3/8 ounce jig head, and that's for more of your shallow water, stuff like 1 to 6 feet, not that much cover. Once you get into the more cover, grass, and all that type of stuff, maybe switch over to a punching rig, start using a 1 ounce jig head, or even higher if you need to. But typically 3/8 is your best overall weight for just general jig fishing purposes. Next, let's talk about the wind. The biggest thing with the wind has to do, once again, with your weight, like we were just talking about. Now, if the wind is blowing super heavy, it's a windy day out there, then you're gonna wanna switch up to a heavier weight to keep that jig on the bottom. If you're dragging it, if you're popping it, no matter what, you wanna keep that jig head on the bottom, because that's typically where the jig shines the most, is when it's sitting there on the bottom and being popped back up. If it's a really windy day and you have a light jig head on, it's not maintaining contact with the bottom. It's just kind of floating up there doing whatever, especially if you're drifting around, drifting along. So when it comes to wind, remember, jig head needs to be heavy enough to where you're maintaining contact with the bottom. When I'm talking about heavier jigs too with the wind, one thing you really do want to be careful of though is making sure you don't go too heavy. And I know I'm starting to overcomplicate it a little bit, but don't worry, once you start fishing it, you'll start figuring this stuff out. The reason why you don't want it to be too heavy is it's going to feel really unnatural in that fish's mouth, and that is probably the biggest downfall of jig fishing, is that unnatural feel of this big heavy weight sitting in that fish's mouth, because as soon as he gets it and he realizes it's not real, he's gonna pop it out. That's why you have to be paying attention and making sure, and pop that hook up. Just remember though, with those big, giant, heavy jig heads, especially those punching rigs, you gotta get that thing through the fish's mouth first before that hook can go up there. And a bigger weight just means the fish has gotta pop it, open his mouth a little bit more for it to get out there when you're trying to force that fish's mouth open and drive that hook up. The next part is your trailers. Trailers, everybody has a different theory on them. My best bet is always try to match your hatch. So the same color as your jig skirt should be the same color as your bait. So if you notice, like I said, same color of your jig skirt should match the color of bait. So this is a shad type color. So what did I do? I threw a shad type colored trailer on there. So that way it just looked more natural. Now sometimes changing it up does work. I have had some success, and I've seen a lot of other anglers have more success than me when they do a little mix match. Either they'll throw pumpkin type color skirt with a black and blue bait, or the reverse, a black and blue skirt with a natural or pumpkin type color trailer, and it has gotten strikes before. I've seen people do it. I've had some success on it, but I have seen some really good anglers, much better than I am, have great luck doing it. You know, just changing it up, giving the fish something a little bit different to see. You just don't want to go too out there with them crazy mismatched colors. When it comes to the actual trailers that I do put on, there's a couple that I like to go to. There's these little Strike Kings that I love. The reason why is it's just a simple worm type body with crawl appendages on there. Nothing too difficult, nothing too crazy, and it gives a great motion. It's very sleek through the water. Another one that I like to throw are these Zoom Z crawl trailers. If you know anything about me, this is probably my favorite soft plastic. I did a review on it a couple videos ago. You can check it out on my channel. And these Zoom Z crawl trailers are just, they're so versatile. I use them all over the place. I use them weightless, I use them with jigs, I use them on Carolina rigs, I use them all over the place. They just work really well. They have really awesome action, as you saw from the footage, and they got these sweet ribs right here which displace a lot of water. And if you're putting some scent on there, trying to change up the game, that's another thing you could do, throw some scent on there. They hold scent very, very well. Zoom Z crawl. I touched up on it in the beginning a little bit, but let me re-emphasize, jig fishing, the best thing about it is you can do it all year long. In the springtime, when the bass are bedding down, you can put those jigs there, shake them in their face, see if it pisses them off enough to where they just, get out of here, and they'll grab it and you can yank that sucker up into your boat. In the summertime, when you're pitched under cover because they're hot and they want to get some shade, or maybe they're under docks, you could pitch it and throw it underneath there. In the fall, when they're trying to fatten up for the winter, throw a swim jig, go move it all around, all throughout the grass, go make it go crazy like they're trying to chase some bait fish. Or even in the winter, when you just drop it on the bottom and you let it slow drag around the bottom, so that way you can feel what the bottom feels like. And a fish that might just be all lethargic sitting there is like, well, I'll go ahead and eat that, because remember, fish in the wintertime don't like to expend a lot of energy, so you want to keep that very slow, just dragging it on the bottom, and bam, fish grabs it. Just remember, if I had to sum up the overall reason why jigs work, is it's a bait that goes down to the bottom, it sits, and you can play with it and pop it up. And the way it works best is when it goes down to the bottom, it's unobstructed down there. I mean, yeah, you got to get through cover and you're going to be around cover and by cover, but the fall itself remains unobstructed, and that fish sees it and he grabs it. That's why the jig works so well. The next big thing is trying to figure out that bite. The bite is kind of insane. How do I put this into words? When you're pitching it and they hit it on the fall, you just know that they got it, because you get this completely different feeling in the line, and it's almost crazy fisherman's instinct. Set that hook and bring that bad boy in. Where it gets a little bit finicky is especially during the colder months when you're dropping it down and you're dragging it. And this can happen in the hotter months too. but you drop it down there and you're popping it up, you're giving little pops every now and again, it might be a little bit harder to detect a bite. So you need to make sure, because if they grab onto that and you don't set that hook right away, they're probably letting go. And because of that brush guard, they're not going to get a good hook set in their mouth. That is why you need to be constantly watching your line. Look for any subtle changes, any subtle movements. You don't want to have too much slack in there. And when I talk about feeling that bite and looking at your line, that's why the rod is very, very important. If you're jig fishing, you can do it, but I highly suggest do not use, once again, do not use, if you have it in your power and your financial ability, to use a two-piece rod. The reason being is you lose so much sensitivity in a two-piece rod. Those two-piece rods, where they connect that, you lose a lot of kinetic energy of when a fish grabs on, and those subtle movements, you can't feel it that well with those two-piece rods. But these one-piece rods, much better. And one thing you need to have when you're feeling for that sensitivity, like I said a little bit earlier, is your line. If you have too much slack in your line, the best jigging rod in the world won't be able to help you, because there's no way you're going to be able to set that hook or even feel that bite to set the hook. You got to have tighter lines. You got to have a little bit of slack in there, because a tight line makes it look very unnatural, but you got to find that perfect balance. The best way I can describe a bite on the jig is kind of like, if you ever been catfishing, or even if you haven't, it's just a thump, you know, because typically they grab it, they might move, they might sit still, who knows, but usually you could feel some type of thump in your line that just doesn't feel natural. As soon as you feel something like that, even if your mind's telling you that it's probably just a branch I bumped into, set that hook. What's the harm in doing that? Set the hook, get that fish in your boat. Another benefit to a jig is how you can feel around. If you don't have a lot of money and you don't have a fish finder or a graph or anything crazy high technological, an easy way to figure out what that bottom is like is throwing this jig and just kind of moving it. You'll be able to tell if that bottom is a rocky bottom, a soft bottom, a grassy bottom. You're going to be able to tell just by dragging that jig along the bottom area. So use this as a search bait. This is an outstanding search bait. Another thing about this jig, what makes it so effective, is how you can throw this thing in cover, and that's where that weed guard comes in again. When you throw this in the cover, that's where bass are typically hiding. That's where they feel safe. They get tucked up on that cover. They feel safe because they have these branches around them, they got leaves around them, they got grass, they got whatever, dock, wood, whatever the heck they got going on. They feel safe around that stuff. That, or they're just trying to keep cool, or both. So that's why these jigs are so great when you fish them around cover. Another cool thing about these jigs is you could skip them. Yes, skip them. Literally skip them in the water. You will take them, throw them, pitch them out, and if they're light enough, they're gonna skip on the water, and you could skip them right underneath a dock, right where a bass is sitting, where he might not be thinking anything's gonna be dropping in there that shouldn't be there. There's a million different ways to throw these things. Skipping's one method. Another method that I highly suggest you learn and get on is flipping a jig or pitching a jig. When you're flipping and pitching, that typically means you're trying to create a nice silent entry into the water, as silent as it can possibly be. Maybe even just simulating a bug falling off a tree limb that's hanging above the water. You know, nice and quiet. If it's too loud, you're gonna scare them away. They're gonna think something suspicious. But then again, who knows? Maybe you're gonna attract a huge one. He's like, "What's up? Dinner just falling in." But overall, you want a more silent entry, and that's where flipping comes in. Because if you do your typical overhead or sidearm cast, you're gonna make a very loud presentation as it goes into the water. You want to quiet that thing down a little bit, especially when the bite is tough. And to do that, you got to learn how to flip and pitch. If you want to learn how to flip and pitch, especially from a kayak, I got a video a while back. Go check it out about how to flip a jig from a kayak. Well, hey, that's about all the time I got for today. There's so much more that I wanted to cover that I didn't cover, but hopefully this helps you out. And if it did, please drop a like and please subscribe if you want to see more videos. We do fishing videos, we do catching videos. Hey, we might even do cooking videos one day, and we got a lot of reviews on awesome products, not just fishing, but overall home stuff, because that's what the artillery life is all about, baby. Y'all have an outstanding one. Artillery fishing.